Morning, good day, and good afternoon. My name is Muhammad Rifal Abizar from SBMITB. I'll be sharing the result of my SI project titled The Role of Governmental Regulation in Shaping the Indonesia Energy Market. In this study, we will look at how different government policies impact our progress in transitioning to cleaner energy. I use a method called Regulatory Impact Assessment, or RIA, to break down how effective these policies really are and where things might be falling short. Indonesia has a huge amount of renewable energy potential. It is over 443 gigawatts from sources like solar, wind, hydro, bioenergy, and also geothermal. But despite that, more than 60% of our electricity still comes from coal. In 2023, the share of renewable in our power mix was just 12.3%. This creates a big gap between our technical potential and what we've actually achieved. And that's especially important when you consider that we've made a big international climate commitments. So, how did I study all of this? I use a framework called RIA. It is a tool developed by the OECD that helps evaluate how well public policies are designed and whether they are really doing what they're supposed to do. In this case, I applied RIA to three key areas. The first one are renewable energy tariffs, especially the Peraturan Presiden 112. Second, the carbon pricing through the NEK system, nilai ekonomi karbon, and IDXCarbon. The third is long-term planning through RUEN and RUED. Before we dive into the analysis, let's take a quick look at where things stand. Indonesia has huge renewable energy potential, like I said, 443 gigawatt, but as of 2023, renewables only made up 12.3% of electricity generation. Electrification is almost complete at 99.72%. It is almost 100, which sound great, but we'll talk about that later. On the investment side, things look a little bit concerning. In the first half of 2023, we only attracted 1.4 billion US dollar in renewable energy investment. Meanwhile, to meet our climate goals, we need about 28.5 billion US dollar per year. And that is what we need to achieve the net zero emission target by 2060. Coal still plays a massive role. Over 60% of electricity comes from coal. And PLN buy coal at a subsidized DMO, domestic market obligation price of 70 US dollar per ton. We have set ambitious policy targets like 23% renewable by 2025. But if you compare that to where we are now, it is clear that we are not on track. So overall, the data shows a big disconnect between what we plan and what we are actually doing. Okay, so here's a quick overview of how energy governance is currently structured in Indonesia. At the top, we have national policy goals set by the President. These goals are directed down to the key ministry. These are the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. But here's the issue. This institution operates in silos. It means that they are working separately. There is no single coordinating agency to align their efforts. On the other hand, PLN, the state-owned utility, is supposed to follow ministerial direction, but in reality, it holds a lot of power over grid access and procurement. So even though the vision comes from the top, the execution ends up fragmented and slow. To explain that a little bit more, Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resource, or short as MEMR, which set the technical rules, doesn't really have the capacity to enforce them. PLN, while technically under MAMR, often becomes the bottleneck because it controls the grid and procurement processes, making it hard for new or private player to enter the system. Then we have the Ministry of Finance, which still manage subsidies like the domestic market obligation price for coal. It is set at just $70 a ton. That price keeps coal artificially cheap and makes renewable less competitive. The Environment Ministry runs the carbon monitoring system, but it is not connected to energy planning. And local government, they are expected to implement energy plans at the regional level, but most of them don't have the budget or authority to make anything happen. So what we actually left with is just a system where everyone working on their own without shared data or coordinated leadership. And that's create confusion. Both for investor and for policymakers. Now, let's talk about renewables. Indonesia has a ton of potential here. Like I said, it is over 443 gigawatt, while we only using about 12% for electricity. But the question is, what's holding us back? First, PLN is still in charge of procurement and they often favor coal because more cheap and the system already there. Second, if you want to build a renewable project, you have to go through more than 20 different permit steps. And that's a big turnoff for investor. There are also local content requirement called TKDN that makes project more expensive, especially for smaller developers. Even though technologies like solar PV and biomass are becoming cheaper and more competitive, these policy hurdles are keeping them on the sidelines. And what's more frustrating is that public support is strong. Over 80% of Indonesians support renewable, especially for community solar and small-scale hydro. But with these inconsistent rules and low bankability, many of these projects never get off the ground. We can look at the data here that we only utilize very small, while there is a lot of untapped energy potential around here. Energy access is not equal to energy equity. On paper, Indonesia has done well with electrification. Over 99% of households are connected, but the reality is it is more complicated. In remote and rural areas, electricity can still be unreliable, expensive, or not even clean. More than 25% of people still rely on biomass for cooking, which is not just inefficient, but also a health risk. Meanwhile, fossil fuel subsidies keep price artificially low for coal and oil, making it harder for renewable to compete. And as research shows, those subsidies mostly benefit wealthier households, not the one who actually need help the most. We also found out that our energy planning document, like RUEN and RUED, it doesn't properly integrate the SDG 7 goals, especially around equity and access. In fact, many provinces doesn't even include equity metrics in their local plans. So while we've made a big progress on coverage, we're still far behind on fairness, and that's something regulation needs to fix. Indonesia has made big international promises. Through our NDC, we have committed to cutting emission by 43.2% by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2060. We also joined global partnership like JETP, which is supposed to mobilize around 20 billion US dollar in climate finance. But when we look at the actual number, the gap is huge. In the first half of 2023, renewable energy investment was only 1.4 billion US dollar compared to the 28.5 billion we need every single year just to stay on track. So what makes us struggle this much? What's holding us back? For starter, Our carbon markets, IDXCarbon and the NAK framework, are still in the early stages. Trading volume is slow and prices are unclear. Even the enforcement is weak. PLN procurement monopoly, rigid subsidies like the coal DMO, and great overcapacity, especially in Jawa Bali, also make it harder for new renewable energy projects to enter the system. And from the investor side, the message is clear. There is too much regulatory uncertainty. The process is long, inconsistent, and hard to navigate. If we want to unlock serious investment, we need to fix the fundamentals. That is mean clearer rules, bankable PPA, and streamline licensing process. Alright, here's a quick recap of everything we have seen so far. First, Indonesia has enormous renewable potential, 443 gigawatts, but only using 12% of it. That gap isn't due to a lack of technology, but a lack of regulatory support. Second, we already have several policy tools like RUEN, RUED, Peraturan Presiden 112, also the carbon market through IDXCarbon and nilai ekonomi carbon. But this still doesn't operate as a system. They are siloed, uncoordinated, and often overlapping. Third, SDG alignment is still weak. We have made progress on electrification, but clean-looking, equity, and rural access are still big challenge. Fourth, the investment gap is massive. We are bringing in only 1.4 billion US dollar in renewable foreign direct investment per year, while we need 28.5 billion US dollar. That's a long way off. On the plus side, public support for renewable is strong. More than 80% of Indonesians are in favor of the energy transition. But institutional power is still concentrated, especially with PLN. So even public support doesn't easily translate into policy action. The big takeaway here is that we're not lacking ambition, we're lacking alignment. The challenge now is to turn all these fragmented efforts into a coordinated transition. So, how did I analyze all of this? I use a tool called Regulatory Impact Assessment, or RIA, which is a framework developed by the OECD. The idea behind RIA is simple but powerful. Before we pass or revise a regulation, we should ask whether it works, does it solve problems, is it cost effective, are there any unintended side effects? In this study, I apply RIA to evaluate three major policies. The first one is the Peraturan Presiden 112 2022 on renewable energy tariffs. Second is the carbon pricing mechanism. It is NAK ETS and IDXCarbon. And the third is the long-term energy planning through RUEN and RUED. We can take a look at the RIA framework. It is includes 5 steps. First is the definition, that is policy objective and policy context. Second are the identification, that is the regulatory option. The third is assessment, assessing the impact. There is a stakeholder consultation, and then the designing the response. This research focuses mainly on the first three: problem definition, option analysis, and cost-benefit assessment. Why only the first three? Because on the consultation, it is involving stakeholder, and we don't have any stakeholder that we could consult. And then also the design is the result of the consultation. So using this approach helped me go just beyond just simply describing the policies. Instead, I could evaluate how these instruments are actually performing, whether they are sending the right signal to the market and supporting the transition we say we want. Now let's break down the findings from the RIA, starting with how the policies are framed and what their real impact look like. First, the definition. On paper, our regulation aims to support the energy transition, reduce emission, grow renewables, and attract investment. But in reality, the policy design still favor fossil fuels. For example, coal is heavily subsidized through the DMO price of just $70 per ton, and PLN still control grid access and procurement. These two factors alone make it hard for renewable to compete. Second, the identification of instrument. I'll look at three key tools. The first one are Perpres 102, Peraturan Presiden 112 that sets renewable energy tariff ceilings but doesn't provide risk sharing or improve bankability. Second, the Nilai Economic Carbon Emission Trading System or NECETS and IDXCarbon exists, but the market is thin, prices are unclear, and enforcement is weak. Lastly, RUN and RUED. While designed to guide long-term planning, they are often misaligned and underfunded, especially at the regional level. So we have tools, but they don't really work together as a system. Third, the impact assessment. From the cost side, we are seeing long permitting processes, more than 20 steps, and strict TKDN requirements that slow down development. But from the benefit side, there are a lot of untapped potential. Research showed that if we introduce stronger carbon pricing, say gradually rising up to $50 per ton by 2040, we could cut emission from the power sector by up to 70% and even reduce total system costs. The problem is, without strong regulatory signals, we are not realizing this benefit. So the conclusion here is, it's not that we lack tools, it's that we haven't designed or coordinated them well enough to achieve the impact we need. So, based on the RIA findings, here are 6 policy recommendations that could help align our regulation with Indonesia's energy transition goals. First, create an independent energy regulator. Right now, PLN holds too much control over procurement and grid access. A dedicated regulator could bring transparency, coordinate across ministry, and give the investor more confidence in the system. This is something both Celius and Humble and van der Ploeg have highlighted. Second, phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Subsidies like the coal DMO make fossil fuels artificially cheap and crowd out renewables. We don't need to cut them overnight, but gradually removing them and redirecting the budget to things like grid upgrade and renewable energy storage will have a huge impact. Third, strengthen the carbon pricing. Right now, our carbon market is narrow and weak. We need to expand it beyond power, include sectors like transport and industry, and set national carbon prices floor. Strong measurement, reporting, and verification, or short as MRV system, are also essential to make this market credible. Fourth, simplify licensing and investment process. Launching a renewable project still requires over 20 steps. We need a one-stop system, more flexible local content rules for small-scale developers, and standardize the power purchase agreement to attract private investment. Fifth, incentivize local government. RUED plans at the provincial level often lack teeth, but if we link central funding to local performance, like renewable targets or equity outcomes, we can empower province to take action. And finally, clarify institutional roles. Right now, there is a lot of overlap between MAMR, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Environment and Forestry, and Bappenas. We need updated laws or executive orders to clearly define responsibilities and improve coordination. Together, these reforms will make the regulatory environment more coherent, investment-friendly, and aligned with both national and global climate goals. Indonesia energy transition is not limited by resources or technology, but by regulation. This is the main takeaway from this research. It is so simple. Why? Because we've got the potential, we've got the public support, and we even got the policy frameworks on paper. But what we don't have is policy coherence, strong enforcement, and consistent signals to the market. The regulatory impact assessment helps shows that many of our tools like Peraturan Presiden 112, IDXCarbon, RUED just exist, but they aren't working together. The system is fragmented, authority overlaps, and without coordination, even the best policies struggle to deliver real outcomes. If we want to unlock Indonesia's clean energy future, we need to stop adding more rules and start improving how they work together. It's time to move from symbolic progress to structural reform. That's the only way we'll achieve a just, affordable, and sustainable energy transition. And that's how the role of governmental policy in shaping Indonesia energy market. Thank you so much for your time and attention. That concludes my presentation on how governmental regulation shapes the Indonesia energy market. I hope this presentation provided valuable insight into the gaps we need to address and the steps we can take to move forward. Let's make sure that regulation becomes not a barrier, but a driver for Indonesia's energy transition. Thank you once again.